Hello all, welcome to this Ask the Experts session for Azure Arc. We are here with a packed room of SMEs. As you know, Azure Arc covers a broad area, so we are here ready to answer all the questions that you would otherwise ask in person if we would be on the booth. So let's go ahead and get started. So the way this will work is that you are free to post the questions that you have in the chat, and we have moderators that will go through them. Some of those questions will be available will be answered on the chat, and some of the questions will be answered by us on camera. So just don't hesitate, throw any question, whether it's technical, business oriented, whatever you have, we have the right people here. Also, just be aware this session is recorded, and let's not do any spamming or things like that. We have quite a lot of people, so you will make our job a lot easier if you just don't send any spam in the chat. And with that, let's just go ahead. I want to make sure that I put a view of everybody that we have here. So I'm Guillermo Gomez, and I will be moderating this session. I'm part of the Azure Arc team, and with me are all my peers, ranging from experts on servers, on Kubernetes, on data services, and as well as machine learning. And with that, let's go ahead. Let's get it started. All right, so we have the first question. There is a lot of traction for Azure Stack HCI integration with Azure Arc. Any plans for bringing some of that Azure Stack Hub? Some of that to Azure Stack Hub, like Azure Arc for servers, for ASH VMs. Happy Azure stacking. Awesome. So I think that this probably is a good question. I don't know, Jason, do you think that this is one that goes in your alley?
So, hey everyone, my name is Jason Hansen. I'm one of the program managers for Azure Arc, specifically enabled Kubernetes and server. And in terms of Azure Stack HCI, and we're definitely seeing a lot of momentum in Azure Stack HCI with offerings like AKS on Azure Stack HCI, as well as the ability to provision and manage virtual machines that are running on that form factor. Now, with respect to Azure Stack Hub, the VMs that you have on Azure Stack Hub today are governed by the standard set of resource providers that you would see on Azure today, which includes CRP, Compute Resource Provider, NRP, Network Resource Provider, and SRP, the Storage Resource Provider. And as such, we see those as Azure VMs. And so the CRP capabilities within Azure Stack Hub today do provide the VM management experience that you have on Azure Stack Hub, as well as the ability to install VM extensions. Now, so you get those capabilities out of the box with Azure Stack Hub. Azure Arc for enabled servers is again focused on bringing those same capabilities to virtual machines that aren't running in an environment that has access to that full Azure Resource Manager integration that you see with Azure Stack Hub. Back to you, G.
Awesome. So we have another question. This one regarding AWS. How does Azure Arc manage AWS resources? Ryan, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Willis. I'm a program manager working on Azure Arc enabled servers. In context of VM management, Arc is great for managing AWS EC2 instances because you want to be able to get one single pane of glass over all of your resources, no matter where they may physically be running. So if you're running a hybrid estate, you got some stuff in Azure, some stuff on-prem, stuff in AWS, you can install the Arc agent on those AWS VMs, and you'll get to see it in the Azure portal and use things like the Azure extensions and Azure monitoring and security tools to get more insights and secure that machine. All the while, you can keep using AWS or whatever data center technology you're using to run that VM to manage it with the native tooling, but you'll get the extra insights and common control plane through Azure Arc so that you can do common interactions and not have to worry about where specifically those VMs might be running.
And there is another question for you, Ryan. How do you see Azure Arc if some servers are managed by provider and some are not?
Yeah, great question. So Azure Arc fully integrates with Azure Lighthouse, which is generally our solution that managed service providers use to get visibility into resources that they are managing on your behalf. So if you're in a situation where you might have some internal IT assets and you might outsource some others, Azure Arc's great because you can onboard the server to a subscription that you own. And if you have someone managing that server for you, you can delegate access to that machine to that managed service provider using Azure Lighthouse. And then they can see it, they can manage it, giving the permissions that you specified, but you retain full control over those assets which you take full control over. So you get to decide who gets to manage what, and you get all the same capabilities with Azure Arc.
And there is another question for you, Ryan. We haven't started using Azure Arc yet. We have a number of Windows servers on VMware ASXi host. How do we get started with working with them in Azure Arc? We don't need Kubernetes, do we?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, if you just want to get started with Azure Arc enabled servers on your VMware VMs, all you really need to do is find a mechanism through which you want to go and onboard all of these servers. And that could be something like group policy, it could be tooling like System Center Configuration Manager or Ansible, whatever you use to deploy apps in your enterprise. Push out our agent to those machines, and then we provide the script that you would use for that process, and then it'll get onboarded into Azure. And once our agent's installed, the rest you can do right from the portal, even with policy for some automated actions like following on and immediately starting monitoring of those machines.
All right, and now I have a question for Travis. How do you see the evolution of the hybrid story of the Azure Arc enabled services?
Yeah, so we've started with Arc-enabled data services, and with there we have the SQL managed instance and PostgreSQL hyperscale services, which are available in preview now. And today at Ignite, we announced the latest addition to the services that are available through Azure Arc, and that is Azure Machine Learning. And as Saria demoed in Jeremy's session today, that enables you to take your machine learning model inferencing workloads and distribute those out to be executed on infrastructure outside of Azure infrastructure. It could be in your data center or an edge site location, and to train those machine learning models where the data is, right? And so those are the kind of three services that we have now, and coming up later this year, we'll announce some additional Azure Arc enabled services, and we're excited to sort of share the roadmap with you in a kind of continuous rolling fashion as we add more and more of our Azure services to the portfolio that can be run wherever you want through Azure Arc.
And Travis, there is a follow-up question to this one. They're also asking about the migration scenarios. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so with migration scenarios, I guess there's kind of two different types of migrations we could think about here, right? One is where you're migrating from wherever you are currently into an Azure Arc enabled service, or into a state where you are leveraging Arc enabled infrastructure management services. So as Ryan was talking about, for example, one example that might be where you have a server that's running in a VM on an ESXi host in vSphere, and you simply install the Arc enabled server's agent on it, and then it becomes managed by Azure. And in a way, that's kind of a migration. It's a migration in place, so you don't actually move your workload anywhere. You just essentially make it managed by Azure in place, right? That's one example. Another example of that kind of more or less in place migration might be something like where you have let's say a SQL server running in your data center today, and you want to start to take advantage of the PaaS-like capabilities of Arc-enabled SQL managed instance. There, the migration process would be something along the lines of backing up your database, copying over the backup file into the Arc-enabled SQL managed instance and restoring it, and then pointing your applications to that new SQL managed instance. So I think of that as kind of one class of migrations, so to speak, where it's still like in your data center. You're just kind of making your data center, wherever that is, your infrastructure, even in other public clouds, Azure capable through Arc, right? And then the second type of migration is where I would think about using Azure Arc as sort of like, I like to think of it as the doorstep into Azure, right? And so there you're talking about scenarios like where maybe I have a virtual machine that's being managed by Azure Arc in my data center, but now I'm ready to move that virtual machine into an Azure hosted virtual machine in Azure infrastructure. Or maybe I want to go from Azure SQL managed instance running on my infrastructure with Arc enabled SQL managed instance, and I want to move that into a Azure SQL managed instance in Azure PaaS, right? And so those kinds of migration patterns, I think, are the next wave of migration patterns that we're going to start to do some more kind of building out of those capabilities to make it easier for customers that are kind of wanting to take a two-step journey into Azure, where you start by modernizing what you have with Azure Arc on your own infrastructure, and then that makes it that much easier to then bring it into Azure infrastructure when you're ready.
Makes sense. I'm going to throw a roadmap question at you. Is there a plan to build services like storage accounts and key vaults on Azure Arc?
So storage account right now is further on the roadmap. So I would say there's no tangible plan. Definitely things like key vault we're looking at closely. I would say that the first foray into it is, Azure Arc for Server has the Key Vault extension, so that you can use that to communicate with Key Vault in the cloud. And we actually have our own internal teams in Microsoft are running Microsoft Infra, are using, I think they have around 15,000 servers that they're using to manage certificates on using Azure Key Vault and obviously through Azure Arc. So that's one example you can use today on servers, and to run Key Vault on the Kubernetes cluster anywhere. That's something that we're definitely looking at, but no set date yet.
Thanks, Nir. And I have a couple of questions for Ryan regarding VMs. The first one is there a way to see the full list of both Azure VMs and Azure Arc VMs in one pane or view?
Yeah, it's a good question. Currently today, that's not possible, but you can get this information from the All Resources view on the Azure portal, where you can go and filter for more than one resource type that you're interested in, as well as the Azure Resource Graph if you're trying to get this information programmatically.
And there are two questions, Ryan, on update management. Here is the first one. Are we going to be able to manage all the patching across environments using Azure Arc in the future? Update management and push all the new patch?
Definitely, yeah. So Azure Arc can help you get your machines onboarded to update management. And then from there, you're going to get all the capabilities the update management provides, which includes visibility into which updates are missing on your machines and being able to set the update schedules for when either a single machine or groups of those machines get updated across your environment.
And there is this one out as well on update management. I'm looking to use Azure Arc in conjunction with Azure Update Management. Presently, this isn't available. Can you advise when this capability may be available?
Yeah, so probably a bit of a confusion there about some wording on the portal page. We're working to get that updated very soon. But if you enable update management on the Azure Automation account, you'll be able to onboard the Arc server. And once it's configured to use update management, when you click the update tab on the Arc server in the portal, you'll be able to see and manage the updates for that individual machine.
All right, and question for Nir. How can someone programmatically onboard on-premise resources to Azure Arc without exposing a secret in code? Does this require using a certificate?
That's a great question. So obviously, when you do a privilege operation or any operation that requires a secret, you need to use the secret. The way that we solve this problem is that if you want to onboard at scale, what we enable you to do is to use a service principal that has a very, very limited scope, meaning it can only create, Azure, in this case, Azure-enabled server resources in the subscription and resource group, so that's the only thing it can do. So you can use that to onboard at scale, and the only risk could be that if somebody steals this SPN, they would be able to register a new server in your resource group. Obviously, that SPN is a secret that you need to use, and we recommend that you kind of store it outside of the script and then use it as a parameter into the script when you run the script to onboard at scale. Most tools like System Center, if you want to use System Center for onboarding or Ansible, or other configuration management allow you to store secrets, outside of the main script, so that then they basically use that secret only when needed, and it's fairly protected as long as it's not used. So both you can use these mechanisms as well as the secret itself is very limited. The service principal has very limited access to just be able to create Azure Arc server resources or Azure Arc Kubernetes resources.
Question for Ryan. Did I hear you say we can now deploy VMs from Azure to Azure Stack HCI?
Yeah, so Azure Arc enabled servers today is about managing existing VMs or physical servers that are already out there. We're really focused on OS management and keeping that compliant with your IT policies and getting other agents and monitoring and security tools deployed to that machine. Definitely keep a lookout for more improvements and capabilities coming in this space, but I don't have anything else to share at this time.
Right, and this question may be for Nir. Can the Arc agent be deployed to servers that have existing agents such as SCCM or SCOM?
Absolutely. I would say this question is much more relevant for Ryan, but for diversity, it's good that you're asking me. Yeah, you can. The whole principle around Arc is to be able to coexist with existing environments, so that Arc is not a disruptor to the way you manage things. So let's say, for example, you wanted to do inventory tagging, governance across your environment, but using many other tools. You could onboard to Arc, get at-scale view of your entire environment, do governance from Azure using a Azure guest configuration policy, but still use all the existing tools, System Center, or other tools that you're using to manage your servers. The only place where this comes into play, where you have, just like any environment where you have multiple systems setting using the same things to set your environment. So if, say, for example, you use Azure Automation DSC to set certain things in your environment, and you use System Center to set other things in your environment, if these clash, then you get into that multi-management paradigms issue. And we actually solve this with Azure Arc, where we allow you with guest configuration to audit your environment so that you can see it's in the right state, so that when there is a case where there's conflicting settings, if the wrong settings are set, you'll be able to see it at scale through the Azure guest configuration, and you'll be able to then go and obviously remediate that issue. So overall, when you introduce Azure Arc into your environment, you can start with an existing environment without any change, and you get immediately that at scale view, that consistent kind of management across any resource, that governance policy, Lighthouse, all the stuff that Azure just provides at scale. And then you can choose to either stay with your current services or move to cloud services to manage across your environment, like update management. Based on your rhythm, based on, you can start with a small set of servers and then move on to the entire environment. The cool thing about what Azure Arc also that helps you there is that once you decided to, say, use a service from Azure, you can onboard it at scale, you can manage it at scale. So what we see customers do is really start with that initial inventory and the policy and governance, and then start moving to services, and that allows them to eventually remove a large set of agents and other solutions that they need to maintain on-prem, and just use cloud services at scale in a consistent manner across their entire environment, across all their Kubernetes clusters, across all their servers. And the cool thing about Arc for Server, it doesn't care about what the server is. Could be physical, virtual, Windows, Linux, domain joined, non-domain joined, static, ephemeral server. So you're able to now really manage your entire set of servers, regardless of their profile, in a consistent way, and govern them together. So we see a lot of customers saving a ton of OpEx and being able to really efficiently manage their entire set of servers wherever they're running.
It's great, the amount of questions that we're having. I have a question here for Saria on ML. What is the relation/integration between Azure Arc and machine learning?
So the question is, what is the integration between Azure Arc and Azure Machine Learning? So I think it's a good question. So the way it is enabled is it leverages Azure Arc for Kubernetes. So pretty much what it does is we deploy a bunch of Kubernetes operators, PyTorch, TensorFlow, and MPI operators on the cluster. And we have our own agent, just like the Arc agent, we have our own agent deployed on the cluster. And that's how the Azure Machine Learning control plane of the service is able to talk to the cluster and be able to deploy training jobs on your behalf. Does that answer the question?
We'll see if there is a follow-up.
Okay.
But thanks, Saria. I don't know if this question is for Travis. Travis, I'm gonna see if this is one that you can answer. Are there any plans for Power BI on Azure Arc?
That's an interesting question. No, at this point, there's no plans for Power BI to be made available on Azure Arc. There are ways to run Power BI, like the Power BI report server, which is available, and you can run that anywhere. So that's what I would recommend for customers that need to be able to run Power BI in their own environment and maybe don't have access in some cases to Power BI hosted in the cloud.
And another question for you, Travis. How Azure Arc can manage an Azure SQL database in the cloud and an on-premise SQL Server infrastructure?
So can Azure Arc manage a SQL in Azure, like in PaaS and an on-premises one?
That's what I understand, yeah. Like how can Azure Arc manage a PaaS SQL database and one that is on a SQL Server outside of Azure, for example?
Okay, so Azure Arc would be used to manage SQL Server. So we have Arc-enabled SQL Server. That's one thing, which is different than Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. So Arc-enabled SQL Server, that builds on top of the technology that Ryan's been talking about with Arc-enabled servers. It's really just an extension to the Arc-enabled servers agent that allows specifically managing SQL servers. And in Azure, if you have a SQL Server running in a VM, I would recommend using the SQL VM capabilities there because although it's not a complete superset, it's pretty close. And so that's the best experience you'll get in Azure is running in a SQL Server in a VM in Azure IaaS. Outside of Azure infrastructure, though, that's where if you have an existing SQL Server, you can simply install the Arc-enabled servers agent plus the SQL Server extension. You can manage any SQL Server anywhere, right? So that could be in your data center, or AWS, or GCP, or anywhere. And it's very simple. It's just an agent install, and you start to manage it in place. You don't have to do anything in terms of migrating things. Now, separately from that, you have Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, and that's more of a PaaS-like capability that gives you a lot of the PaaS-like abilities where you can do self-service provisioning, deprovisioning, elastic scalability. It's a continuously updated service. The database instances are automatically updated with no application downtime. There's built-in monitoring and a backup and point-in-time restore service, and it really feels a lot like the PaaS service in Azure, but it's running on your infrastructure. And so you kind of have a variety of different options here, but the idea is that regardless of which of these options you choose, you can go to a consistent centralized place in the Azure portal or ARM APIs or Azure CLI and manage all of these types of SQL regardless of where they are. So you kind of have different solutions depending upon your requirements, but the way that you manage them becomes much more consistent across all of them, including the PaaS services like Azure SQL Managed Instance and PaaS, as well as things like Azure SQL DB or even database pools and all those different flavors of SQL that we have.
All right, I'm gonna move on to Ryan with a question on server. How is the Azure Arc agent updated? Does it require a reboot of the server? Like, how does it get updated? Does it require a reboot?
Yeah, very good question. So our agent is not integrated with the OS, so it does not require a reboot. Nice and easy. If you are on a Windows machine, it will get updates through Microsoft Update if you have that enabled. And on Linux, we will be updated whenever you perform an update with your package manager. In the future, we are looking into offering automatic updates out of band as well. So that's of interest, definitely let us know. We'd like to hear your feedback on how we keep these things up to date.
And there is another question on the Arc agent. Will the Arc agent also get monitoring data, or will you have to install the Azure monitoring agent also?
Yeah, good question. So the Arc agent, Arc server specifically, the best way to think about it is we are just connecting that machine into Azure. We're very lightweight. We don't do a ton on our own, and our job is to make sure that you get a consistent experience with the Azure VMs. So when you go to the portal and say, hey, I'd like to monitor this and enable some of these insights or security center experiences on my machine, we take responsibility for downloading and configuring that monitoring agent for you. And then that agent is the one that's actually sending the data up. So there are still technically two agents, but we refer to them as extensions because we take the responsibility of getting it installed and updated and configured, leaving it so you can do all that from the Azure portal and not having to sign into the machine or your network and do that manually yourself.
And Ryan, maybe this question is broader, but I think that maybe you can answer it. Azure Arc is priced. How is Azure Arc priced for on-premise resources? Is it priced per resource?
Yeah, good question. So I'll start with Arc-enabled servers. The core experience of Arc-enabled servers, which involves getting your machine showing up in Azure, being able to use tags for inventory purposes, extensions to go push down these other agents and provide that cloud-native onboarding experience, that is all free of charge. The only thing you pay for are the services you use with Azure Arc. So for example, if you're monitoring that machine, you'll pay for the data used to store those logs up in Azure. Jason, do you want to answer on the Kubernetes side?
Sure, happy to. So much like Arc-enabled servers, Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes is included in your Azure subscription for connecting Kubernetes clusters into Azure. That gives you the same experiences that Ryan mentioned for server, where you can see your Kubernetes clusters in the portal. You can put them into a subscription in a resource group. You can apply tags, and you can query over those clusters using services like Azure Resource Graph. Now, where you might incur charges is if you bring your own Kubernetes cluster using Arc and it's running on-prem and you'd like to deploy configuration management service, there's a charge for that service. It starts at $2 per vCPU per month, and we include 6 vCPUs included with your subscription. Other services like Azure Monitor can be enabled, and Azure Monitor charges for data that is stored in log analytics. So when and where you have your metrics flowing up to log analytics, that retention is what spins the meter for that particular service. Last but not least, if you're using offerings like AKS on Azure Stack HCI or Azure Stack Edge, those services are considered to be Azure services, and you're paying for them as such. And services like GitOps, for example, are included in that base cost for compute.
Okay, and we're approaching the end. So Nir, maybe one last question or one couple of last questions for you. The first one is, Azure Arc is great, but the first question I get when talking about Azure Arc is always, what about deploying infrastructure like VMs, K8s, etc. via Azure Arc?
I think this is an awesome question. We got this question immediately after we announced Azure Arc for servers, so we certainly think this is an important thing for us to go look at, and I would say stay tuned.
All right, and then I think that there is one more that you can answer. We have former SolarWinds customers looking to replace Orion for network monitoring. Does the Azure Arc roadmap include on-prem networking devices arranged in a user-defined network topology that might replace Orion functionality?
Well, I would say that there's a few things. I don't know the product that well, so hard for me to answer. If anybody else knows the product, they can jump in. I know that you can do monitoring of networking from inside the VM that VM Insights already provides, and we're using this heavily with multiple partners and customers. But if anybody else knows the specific product, happy for them to jump in and answer.
We probably, we are a minute away, so I'm gonna have to go into the resources because that's all the time we have. I just saw the amount of questions that we had, and there were a lot. We probably needed more time. I want to say before we go before we get disconnected. The first one is that we have here a lot of resources for you. So if you want to keep learning, you can go to aks.ms/learning@ignite. And to keep up to date on everything on Azure Hybrid, we have another URL here. But the other thing that I want to mention, as I said, we had a lot of questions that we couldn't answer, and we have 2 roundtables with some of the same folks that we have here of Azure Arc. So feel free to join those. One of them is today from 4 to 5 p.m. and tomorrow is 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time, so Redmond time. And tomorrow, March 3rd, from 1 to 2 p.m. and to 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific as well. To register, you just have to go to the Ignite website and click on Product Roundtables, and you will see that the Product Roundtables are under the connection zone. If somebody can paste in the chat the links, and there is a link, I believe, and then there is a code. So PRT135 and PRT168. There you will have another opportunity to keep asking questions and get answers. And with that, I want to thank everybody that was able to join and hope you have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.